Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. If you'd like to see your name in the credits and gain access to a plethora of other perks, bonuses, and extras, please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you.
They've adopted a methodology that is actually impervious to evidence. Right? Like Dawkins recently admitted this. He was being interviewed, and he's asking what would qualify as evidence for the existence of God. And he said, years ago I would have said, God writing his name in the sky or something like this, or a miracle or something like this. But I've come to realize that there's nothing that God could do that I couldn't just say aliens did it.
Are you kidding me? As though one's hesitancy to accept the existence of a hitherto unobserved magical being serves as evidence for radical skepticism.
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arms.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of the most annoying religious people. Up for today is apologist David Wood, a Christian who's asked, "Hey David, what's the best way to share the Gospels with atheists?" Instead of answering this question, David chooses instead to take this as an opportunity to attack atheists, alleging that their worldview is impervious to evidence. David suggests that atheists have created a methodology which entails the impossibility of God from the outset. In other words, and in typical apologist style, David attempts to undermine atheists with claims of stubbornness and irrationality, focusing the majority of his assault on one Richard Dawkins. So without further ado, let's dive right into David's claims and see what this is all about. I hope you enjoy it.
So next question is from Stickman Sam. He says, David, as a former atheist, what's your advice for Christians on how to share the gospel with atheists?
Step number one, and I don't think lots of Christians do this, is trying to figure out what level of skepticism this person has, right? Like some people are just, they haven't heard a good argument for theism, but if you gave them one, they would, think about it and consider it and decide whether it's a good argument. And others, they've adopted a methodology that is actually impervious to evidence. Right? Like Dawkins recently admitted this. He was being interviewed, and he's asking what would qualify as evidence for the existence of God. And he said, years ago I would have said, God writing his name in the sky or something like this, or a miracle or something like this. But I've come to realize that there's nothing that God could do that I couldn't just say aliens did it. Right. If God arranged the stars to say something specifically to us, I could say, well, maybe they're powerful enough aliens who have done this. And so,
first things first, David doesn't do us the favor of citing where Richard Dawkins allegedly said this. So in some sense, David expects us to take his word for it, that nothing could or would change Dawkins' mind.
They've adopted a methodology that is actually impervious to evidence. Right? Like Dawkins recently admitted this.
But I'm not going to take David's word for it, because taking an apologist's word for it is stupidity in its purest form. With this in mind, I did some homework and I found the discussion that I believe David was referring to. Hosted by Pangburn Philosophy, the discussion in question occurred on October 1st, 2017. Given that Dawkins does in fact use the alien thought experiment which David attributes to him, I think we have good reasons to suspect that the following clip is the precise moment that David is responding to. But you can be the judge. Have a listen.
I have to confess that if I'm asked what it would take to falsify my non-belief in God, or what it would take to convince me of anything supernatural, I find it very hard. I used to think it'd be easy. You just God would appear in clouds and chariots of fire and things.
Well, that's a start, isn't it?
I used to think that, but I mean, I've seen so many good conjuring tricks and where you absolutely swear blind it's supernatural, and yet we know it's a trick. I suppose that if Jesus came down in a chariot from a cloud, that would do it for me, but
I want that piece of video excerpted and put on YouTube.
I still think, actually, a more plausible explanation than anything supernatural is natural we don't yet understand. And so a trick wrought by an alien civilization that we don't know about yet or something is actually as implausible as it is more plausible than the laws of physics have been violated, which is what we're kind of talking about.
And there you have it. Again, I think it's quite likely that this is the very clip that David is citing. But even if it isn't, it's no big deal, as we get the thrust of Dawkins' thinking on the matter in this clip anyway. So the question is, does David accurately capture Dawkins' sentiment? I think not. For example, did Dawkins admit that his atheism is impervious to evidence, as David would have us believe?
They've adopted a methodology that is actually impervious to evidence. Right? Like Dawkins recently admitted this.
Again, I think not. No reasonable viewer could possibly construe Dawkins' comments in this manner. Clearly, Dawkins is merely describing the difficulty he encounters when trying to imagine that which would falsify his atheism. In fact, Dawkins demonstrates his humility here by pointing out his change of heart on the question. Whereas he used to believe that God appearing in the clouds or some such phenomenon would make converting straightforward and easy.
I used to think it'd be easy. You just God would appear in clouds and chariots of fire and things.
He now realizes that such an occurrence could be better explained by trickery.
I used to think that, but I mean, I've seen so many good conjuring tricks.
Or by an advanced alien civilization, etc.
A trick wrought by an alien civilization that we don't know about yet or something is actually as implausible as it is more plausible than the laws of physics have been violated, which is what we're kind of talking about.
In short, Dawkins argues, these naturalistic explanations are more likely than a suspension of the laws of physics. As the philosopher David Hume once put it, though the being to whom the miracle is ascribed be, in this case, almighty, it does not, upon that account, become a whit more probable, since it is impossible for us to know the attributes or actions of such a being, otherwise than from the experience which we have of his productions in the usual course of nature. This still reduces us to past observation, and obliges us to compare the instances of the violation of truth in the testimony of men with those of the violation of the laws of nature by miracles, in order to judge which of them is most likely and probable. As the violations of truth are more common in the testimony concerning religious miracles than in that concerning any other matter of fact, this must diminish very much the authority of the former testimony. In other words, and according to Hume, the almighty miracle worker hypothesis is less likely, it's less probable when compared with other potential naturalistic explanations, such as misapprehension, lying, or simple human error. So it would seem that Dawkins is in good company vis-a-vis his hesitation to jump to God did it as an explanation for anything. But I digress. To repeat, does David accurately capture Dawkins' sentiment? Did Dawkins state or even imply that his atheism is impervious to evidence? The answer, of course, is no. Far from suggesting that his atheism is impervious to evidence, Dawkins supposes that Jesus coming down in a chariot from the clouds might do it for him.
I suppose if Jesus came down in a chariot from a cloud, that would do it for me,
But the thrust of Dawkins' overall point is that it's difficult to explain that which would change his mind vis-a-vis the supernatural.
I find it very hard. I used to think it'd be easy.
Something which David completely fails to capture in his straw man. And that's all it is, a straw man. I must admit, it always amuses me how theists misrepresent atheists in order to debunk them. It's almost as if they don't have a leg to stand on. Who knew? With that said, and by my lights at least, Dawkins is spot on here. If one is seeking to understand and explain the world with reference to a specific causal agent, then evidence which points specifically to that agent is required. David's response is to imply that atheists would be unreasonable to reject the existence of the Christian God were they to receive a message in the stars.
They've adopted a methodology that is actually impervious to evidence.
But before we address this point, let me say this. I don't buy for a second that David holds to this position. Are you telling me, David, that you would drop to your knees and convert to Islam in the morning if you witnessed an Islamic message written in the stars? Perhaps you would, but I doubt it. I suspect that David would be quick to table alternative hypotheses such as hallucination, aliens, or perhaps even the devil of his own faith tempting him to abandon Christ. Case in point, when discussing the alleged visitation of Muhammad by the angel Gabriel, David is quick to table an alternative hypothesis, namely that Muhammad was spoken to by demons as opposed to an angel or any god.
Muslims think of this, as a wonderful night when Muhammad starts receiving revelations. Whatever he encountered, he's the only one there, whatever he encountered in that cave, he was convinced that it was demonic and squishing him, and he ran out of there depressed and idle and tried to kill himself as a result of it, concluding that he was demon-possessed. And I would just have to say, sometimes your first impression is the correct one.
And here's the thing. David's hesitancy to accept the truth of Islam here is entirely justified. For strange experience in a cave, therefore Allah, is quite the leap. But the same is true for the experience that's articulated in David's thought experiment. Islamic message in the sky, therefore Allah, would be too hasty a conclusion. Based on prior probability alone, hallucination would be a likelier explanation. By the same token, aliens would be more likely. For at least the aliens hypothesis doesn't require the invocation of anything supernatural. After all, aliens, as I'm conceptualizing them in this video, are little more than extraterrestrial life forms that evolved elsewhere in the universe. Nothing about alien life forms transgresses our understanding of the natural world, biology, chemistry, etc. So again, based on prior probability alone, sufficiently advanced and technologically equipped aliens would be a likelier explanation than a god. The point is, our inductive experience reveals Allah to be an unlikely explanation. And whether David likes it or not, this probability calculus doesn't change even if we swap out Islam for Christianity. Suffice to say, Dawkins is entirely justified in the skepticism he articulates vis-a-vis God being the best explanation for allegedly divine aerial phenomena. But this doesn't stop David from pretending that such skepticism is somehow extreme.
But if it becomes clear in the conversation that they are these hyper-skeptical people, I'm not gonna move beyond the phase of, you've got a problem in your methodology.
Are you kidding me? As though one's hesitancy to accept the existence of a hitherto unobserved magical being serves as evidence for radical skepticism. The problem with David's hypothesis is this: God appears to be unfalsifiable. This makes any appeal to God as the best explanation for anything immediately suspicious. But no, according to David, those of us who aren't willing to instantly believe in the Christian God after having seen a message in the stars are hyper-skeptics.
Hyper-skeptical?
Well, what David calls hyper-skepticism, I call skepticism. No rational and reasonable person would ever jump to God in order to explain an astonishing aerial phenomenon involving the stars, even if that phenomenon included an allegedly religious message. The truth would be, gee, I don't know how this happened. Whereas David would like us to conclude, in spite of our ignorance, something like this: gee, I don't know how this happened, therefore God. This is textbook God of the Gaps reasoning, and David doesn't even realize it. Think about it. If you witnessed the stars realign to spell Jesus is the Lord your God, the truth would be you'd have no idea what just happened. You'd be bamboozled. Clearly, the presence of the Christian message doesn't demonstrate the Christian God, no more than discovering Jesus on toast does. But for David, the allegedly Christian pattern in the stars is enough to conclude that the Christian God is the best explanation for such aerial phenomena. Well, I've got news for you, David. If such patterns serve as good evidence for that which they're pointing to, then you've got a whole host of things that you gotta start believing, my friend. In fact, you better rush out and purchase a Quran right now, because there's a whole host of aerial appearances which appear to point in the direction of Allah, the one true God. And why not bow down to the almighty frog? Because we all know he's appeared in a place or two in our time. Clearly, this is nonsense. Now, some of you will undoubtedly come to David's defense here and allege that I've latched onto the incorrect feature of David's thought experiment. It's not about the content of the message, it's about the miraculous nature of the stars realigning. That's the thing that proves God's existence. But please notice that just brings us straight back to the God of the gaps problem, because you don't know how this aerial phenomenon has occurred. Unexplained aerial phenomena are just that, unexplained. You cannot leap from an unexplained aerial phenomenon to your God. That is a non sequitur. And yes, it's still a non sequitur even if the unexplained aerial phenomena spells out the name of your God, or spells out a message that is compatible with your religion, etc. For if you suggest otherwise, you're going to have no choice but to accept the existence of a whole host of supernatural entities for which patterns have been identified all over the shop, including in the sky, in the lightning, and even in cups of fucking coffee. Suffice to say, God of the Gap's reasoning is garbage. I can't explain X, therefore God is hogwash. But for David, I don't know how this happened, therefore God appears to be enough. And those of us who are unwilling to engage in such fallacious shenanigans get labelled as hyper-skeptics.
Hyper-skeptical.
This is absurd, but it's just typical, isn't it? When David refers to Dawkins and other atheists as hyper-skeptics, it's not a compliment. What he's implying here is that atheists are, to one extent or another, fundamentally irrational. But leave it to a Christian to allege that atheists' epistemic standards are too high, rather than admit that their God is an evidentially bankrupt and unfalsifiable myth that belongs in the trash heap alongside Zeus, Odin, and the rest. You see, the problem is, and as I've already pointed out, the God hypothesis is unfalsifiable. God, according to those that believe in him, is a supernatural entity. This means that God is composed of a substance or substances that exist beyond the natural world. God is non-spatial or spaceless. God is eternal or timeless. God is non-physical or immaterial. While some may be tempted to glean over these descriptors, the fact is they couldn't be more relevant to Dawkins' difficulty in answering the question, what would change your mind? David would have us believe that said difficulties are rooted in a methodology which doesn't allow any evidence to the contrary.
They've adopted a methodology that is actually impervious to evidence.
But this simply isn't the case, and here's why. When asked what would change your mind, atheists are being asked to affirm and describe God and/or the trace evidence that such an entity would leave behind. All the while, the very description of this entity defies any expectation of discovering such evidence, or even conceptualizing what this evidence would look like. To put it another way, how can the atheist conceptualize something non-physical that exists outside of space and time? An honest attempt to conceptualize such an agent reveals an inability to do so. So when Dawkins relays his difficulties with explaining what would convince him of the existence of such an outlandish and hitherto unobserved entity, he's not attempting to avoid a challenge, nor is he erecting a methodology that's impervious to counter-evidence. Rather, he's honestly acknowledging the limits of his knowledge and the epistemological constraints associated with supernatural propositions.
I find it very hard. I used to think it'd be easy.
Yet, David smugly assumes and downright asserts that Dawkins is merely stuck in his ways. This is nonsense.
Well, I normally start, they say, give me evidence for the existence of God. And I go, okay, first, give me evidence that you exist, because I don't want to be talking to a non-existent person here. Right. And then they say, it's usually typing, right? They're sending me messages, and then they type back, what do you mean? Obviously, I exist because I'm sending you a message. Right. So I type back and I go, well, yeah, there's a message, but I mean, it could be monkeys mindlessly pounding on a keyboard. Right. Obviously, if DNA can form on its own, some monkeys can type this sort of message, especially with all these misspellings and so on. Right. And so, I type a message back like that, and if we keep going back and forth and they keep giving me reasons to believe that they exist, and I dismiss them, and then eventually they'll say something like, well, I'll come to your city and I'll show myself. I'm going, how will I know I'm not dreaming? Right. How will I know I'm not in the Matrix? Right. How will I know that I'm not a brain in a vat that some mad scientist is making me think that you're appearing to me? How can I know? In other words, I'm becoming a hyper skeptic, but applying it to them to show them, hey, this is what you do with God. Right. This is what you do when I give an argument for God. So why am I going to give you an argument for the existence of God when all you're going going to do is play skeptic, and I can do that too. And if I play skeptic like you do, you can't even prove to me that you exist.
That's good.
David's reductio is hogwash, articulating skepticism about whether or not the sender of a DM is in fact human doesn't come close to typifying the skepticism that atheists bring to bear on the God hypothesis. When I receive a DM, there's a patchwork of evidence which comes to bear in that moment. Let's suppose, for example, that my mother sends me a DM. What reasons do I have to believe that said DM is actually from her and isn't some monkey typing random letters? Consider the following. I've known my mother my whole life. She has sent me messages in the past. Abstracted further, I've witnessed other people sending and receiving DMs. DMs themselves contain words, phrases, and sentences, which I know to be the product of human cognition. I understand how social media functions such that people can communicate over vast distances and so forth. In some sense, I have an embarrassment of inductive evidence which confirms the existence of the human sender, that is, my mother. The question is, do we have anything like this evidence for God? And the astoundingly obvious answer is no. David can't show us a God. He can't show us a communique from God, only scriptures that are asserted as such. He can't provide an argument that isn't riddled in fallacies, etc. In short, he has no good evidence, inductive or otherwise. Despite this, David thinks he's parodying Dawkins when he responds to atheist DMs by demanding that they prove their existence. What David means by proof here is deductive, as he shoots down each and every inductive piece of evidence. For example, when the atheist points out that they obviously exist, evidenced by the very message they've sent, David suggests that this isn't proof of their existence, for the same message could have been produced by the random key punching of a monkey. And sure, this is logically possible, but the question is it inductively likely? And needless to say, it isn't. In truth, and as I've already demonstrated using my mother as an example, we very often have good inductive reasons to believe that the DMs we receive are of human origin. But David won't accept inductive evidence in his parody, demanding instead that the atheist offer some kind of deductive proof for his own existence. David does this because he believes that atheists are behaving in more or less the same way vis-a-vis God's existence. But this comparison is absurd. Dawkins isn't looking for a deductive proof for God, nor does his response to God appearing in the clouds suggest as such. Pointing out that an allegedly divine aerial phenomenon is more likely to be explained by aliens is not the same as suggesting that a DM received by an atheist could have been produced by a monkey. In fact, whether he intended it or not, David's reductio is an own goal. For the true comparison is this. In the same manner that DMs are inductively more likely to be the product of human cognition as opposed to a monkey smashing random keys, a message in the sky is inductively more likely to be the product of an advanced alien technology as opposed to a god. Why? Well, as Dawkins put it, nothing about aliens using advanced technology violates the laws of physics.
A trick wrought by an alien civilization that we don't know about yet or something is actually as implausible as it is more plausible than the laws of physics have been violated, which is what we're kind of talking about.
Furthermore, given the vastness of the universe, many assert that extraterrestrial life is not only possible, but probable. And given our own technological feats, it's not altogether absurd to suppose that intelligent creatures, not unlike ourselves in their creative capacities, could develop advanced technology elsewhere in the universe. The point is, failing to be convinced of God's existence after witnessing an allegedly divine message in the sky is not the same as failing to be convinced of a human's existence after receiving a DM. In the case of the allegedly divine message, we have strong countervailing reasons to doubt the divine origin, including, but not limited to, our ignorance pertaining to the causal factors which led to such an astonishing phenomenon, the absence of any or all evidence for the existence of a god or gods, the unfalsifiability of supernatural claims, competing naturalistic explanations such as illusions, hallucinations, or even aliens, itself a hypothesis which is more likely based on prior probability alone. In the case of denying a fellow human's existence after receiving a DM, as David does in his parody, we don't have strong countervailing reasons, for all of us have encountered fellow humans in the flesh, and have witnessed and even participated in DM sending and receiving. To put it plainly, all of the inductive inferences run in the opposite direction of David's doubt in the DM case. Sure, no amount of inductive evidence will ever produce the deductive certainty that David demands in his parody, but nothing Dawkins said on stage could be reasonably construed as a demand for deductive certainty either. This is the crucial disanalogy between Dawkins' comments and David's parody. Dawkins isn't expecting a deductive proof of God's existence. Shockingly, Dawkins wants more than a mere assertion. He wants something more than an argument from incredulity, where one assumes that God is the best explanation for some unexplained phenomenon, despite the fact that God is a hitherto unobserved entity who appears to be utterly unfalsifiable. But rather than honestly acknowledge or contend with any of this, David misrepresents Dawkins by pretending that he's a deeply unreasonable thinker who's decided in advance that God is impossible a priori.
I don't walk around going, show me a square circle. Why? Because I don't even believe that a square circle is possible. So I'm not going to be going around asking people for evidence of it. Right? But these guys, they've made their worldview immune to evidence that conflicts with their worldview, and then they ask for evidence against it. And so it's like, it's just ridiculous.
Clearly, this is nonsense. Nothing Dawkins said comes close to suggesting that he's ruled out the existence of God a priori. If Dawkins is guilty of anything, it's honestly acknowledging his difficulty in elucidating what exactly would change his mind, due in no small part to the elusive and unfalsifiable nature of the God hypothesis.
I find it very hard. I used to think it'd be easy.
In closing, David's thought experiment is garbage. His parody attempts to denigrate atheists by saying that if they won't hypothetically accept extravagant evidence, such as messages in the sky, then what's the point in conversing with them at all? But as I hope I've demonstrated in this video, while such evidence would in fact be extravagant, the problem is there doesn't appear to be a legitimate inference which links David's God to this extravagant evidence, namely the allegedly divine aerial phenomenon. Better still, there doesn't appear to be a legitimate inference which links any God to the allegedly divine aerial phenomenon, let alone the Christian God. An argument from incredulity appears to be necessary in order to bridge the gap. Something like, gee, I don't know what happened, therefore God. Pointing out the fallaciousness of such a leap does not render anyone a hyper-skeptic, nor does noting that there exists other potential explanations which have the advantage of complying with the laws of physics. You see, David thinks that atheists are the problem, when in actuality, the problem is his very own hypothesis. It's not Dawkins' fault that David's hypothesis is poorly defined. It's not Dawkins' fault that the God hypothesis is unfalsifiable. It's not Dawkins' fault that David has failed to offer a satisfactory inference which connects his chosen deity to any observed phenomenon, let alone the fanciful aerial messages articulated in the hypothetical. But no, according to David, everyone else is to blame. It couldn't possibly be the case that his God fails to meet basic epistemic and inferential requirements. Atheists are just hyper-skeptics. My ass. More like David here is a hyper-moron.